Well, President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, has flipped, and today he pleaded guilty in court to conspiracy to obstruct justice and conspiracy against the U.S. He will now cooperate with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. The deal allows Manafort to avoid a second trial that had been scheduled to start next week in Washington. He's also been already found guilty of 8 counts during a first trial last month. Well, in response to the deal, the White House released the following statement. This had absolutely nothing to do with the president or his victorious 2016 presidential campaign. It is totally unrelated. Joining me now, Scott Wong. He's a senior staff writer for The Hill. So, Scott, it still remains to be seen what Manafort will be able to give the special counsel. But, you know, this is really just the latest in a series of former Trump aides to plead guilty. Can you gauge what the political impact could this have on the president himself?
Well, I think this is more bad news for the president right before the November midterms. It creates more doubts about whether there was any sort of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Remember, Paul Manafort held a key post in the Trump campaign. He was the campaign chairman. He was somebody who was in Trump Tower, who was in the room for a lot of these meetings, somebody who had tremendous access to the future president of the United States. In fact, during one of those key meetings is really at the center of the Robert Mueller Russia investigation. It took place in June 2016, where Manafort and a number of other top Trump campaign operatives met with a Russian official who was shopping dirt on Hillary Clinton. And so Mueller now has access to all of this information. We don't know exactly what Manafort knows, but he certainly saw and heard a lot during his time as campaign chairman.
And, you know, Giuliani said today that the president has done nothing wrong. The White House likes to claim that this case has nothing to do with the president or even the campaign. Do you think that effort to sort of distance the president is still working?
It remains to be seen. I think there is a public perception, certainly, that we've seen in a lot of polls. The American public is siding with Robert Mueller and the Russia investigation over President Trump. Now, the president is doing his best to try to discredit it, calling it a witch hunt, a political witch hunt, any negative stories about him, fake news. But I think we are starting to see, you know, the day in and day out pursuit of this Russia investigation is manifesting itself in the minds of the American public, and we're seeing that reflected in some of the polling.
And Scott, you know, we've seen the president praise Manafort and also on the other side continue to slam those people who have flipped. I want to actually play a bite for you from last month.
One of the reasons I respect Paul Manafort so much is he went through that trial. You know, they make up stories. People make up stories. This whole thing about flipping, they call it. I know all about flipping. For 30, 40 years, I've been watching flippers. Everything's wonderful, and then they get 10 years in jail, and they flip on whoever the next highest one is, or as high as you can go. It almost ought to be outlawed. It's not fair.
So it appears that he may have spoke too soon. Do you expect the president to change his tune on Manafort now?
Right. There had been a lot of speculation and discussion that perhaps the president would try to pardon Paul Manafort ahead of any sort of deal that he reached with federal prosecutors. At this point, I think the stakes are certainly just too high. Paul Manafort is facing years, if not decades, in prison. And so, you know, in order to reduce some of that prison term and try to drop some of these charges, a number of them were dropped in this plea agreement. I think Manafort is going to side and go all in with prosecutors and do his best to cooperate.
Does it work for Democrats to keep using sort of these latest developments in their midterm messaging?
Well, if you ask Democrats, they are trying their best not to focus on Manafort, on the Russia investigation. They really feel like the public and voters already know about this stuff. They feel like they don't need to hammer it home. They really feel like they need to focus on a message about the economy and about what a Democratic-controlled Congress would look like in the future. Even though we are seeing a number of economic indicators going extremely well, that does favor Republicans. But Democrats' message is that there are a number of Americans who are being left behind in this economic boom, and that if you vote with Democrats in this November election, Democrats are going to bring everyone include everyone in this economic resurgence.
I want to ask you about Hurricane Florence bearing down on the East Coast. We know the White House is still dealing with the fallout of President Trump's tweets on Puerto Rico. What's the reaction on Capitol Hill? The
reaction was not good. A number of Republicans, everyone from Speaker Paul Ryan to Florida Republicans like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and Ron DeSantis, who is running for governor in Florida, another Republican, criticized the president, not so much directly calling the president out by name, but really pushing back and refuting this idea that the 3,000 death toll that Hurricane Maria inflicted on the island of Puerto Rico was inflated. Paul Ryan said he personally had visited Puerto Rico in the aftermath of that hurricane, and what he found was just utter devastation, roads washed out, power knocked out on the entire island. And that led him to believe that, there certainly was a lot of suffering, a lot of casualties, and a lot of people who just could not be reached in certain parts of that island. He said he had no reason to believe that the 3,000 number was incorrect.
Yeah, hurricanes have a great deal of aftermath afterwards, and sometimes it is very political. Scott Wong, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Scott.
Thank you very much.